Have you ever felt like everything looks the same, but something inside you isn't anymore? Nothing big happened, no clear confession, just a very subtle feeling, quiet, almost easy to miss, but enough to make you pause, a little longer than usual. And in that moment, you find yourself wondering, could it be that someone has touched your life, not to change everything, but simply to help you see yourself a little more clearly? There are days when everything unfolds just as it always does. You wake up, move through familiar routines, reply to messages that don't really mean much. Life continues, as if nothing needs to change. And most of the time, you don't question it. Everything feels fine, or at least it looks fine. But then, a very small moment appears. No warning, no loud signal, no remarkable event. Just, you pause. Maybe it happens while you're scrolling through a message, or when your eyes rest on someone, a little longer than usual, just a second. But that second feels different. You're not rushing anymore, not reacting the way you usually do. Something holds you there, in that moment, just a little longer. And you begin to notice there's a very subtle feeling spreading within you. It's not clear. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't feel like happiness. But it's not quite sadness either. It's just a quiet ripple, like a soft breeze passing over still water. You don't know where it came from, and you're not sure where it's going. But, you felt something, and whatever it is, it doesn't feel entirely familiar. Maybe before this, you were used to moving quickly through your emotions. You'd feel something, and then let it pass. No pause, no holding on. Almost like a way to protect yourself from what couldn't be fully understood. But this time, something feels different. You don't push it away. You let it stay. Naturally, as if a part of you wants to listen. And then, almost without realizing it, you begin to notice the smallest things. The way someone looks at you, not for long, but long enough to feel it. The way a simple sentence lingers in your mind longer than expected. The way you suddenly think of someone, not because they did anything special, but simply because they crossed your mind. Small things, but enough to shift something inside you. What's interesting is, no one else can see this. From the outside, everything looks the same. You're still you, still talking, still smiling, still moving through your usual life. But somewhere deeper, something is moving. Not fast, not intense, but real. And maybe that's what made you pause. Not because you understand what's happening, but because you can feel a part of you is waking up, quietly, without needing explanation, just there. Sometimes the biggest shifts in life don't begin with big moments. They begin with something so small, almost no one notices. A glance, a feeling, a passing thought. That doesn't leave. And if you truly listen, you might begin to realize this isn't an interruption. It's an invitation, a very quiet one, to pause and look a little deeper within yourself. Sometimes someone enters your life without any noise at all. They don't arrive with anything obvious, nothing that demands your attention right away. And from the outside, everything still looks the same. Nothing seems to have really changed. But then, in a very quiet way, you begin to notice that you're seeing things differently. Not because they said something profound, not because they tried to change you, but because when you're around them, you no longer feel the need to be someone else. You don't have to choose your words so carefully. You don't have to wonder if you're interesting enough. You don't have to hold on to an image just to be accepted. You're simply there. And somehow that feels lighter. Maybe before this, you were used to adjusting yourself, a little to fit in, a little to avoid being misunderstood, a little more to meet other people's expectations. And over time, those small adjustments added up, until you weren't even sure anymore which part of you was real. But when this person appears, you begin to let those things go. Not because you made a decision to change, but because you no longer feel the need to hold on to them. Around them, you don't perform, you don't try, you don't shape yourself into something easier to accept. You're just yourself. And somehow, that feels like enough. There's a feeling that's hard to name when you're with someone like that. It's not intense excitement. It's not overwhelming emotion. It's something softer, a quiet kind of peace that doesn't need a reason. You can sit in silence and not feel uncomfortable. You can say nothing and still feel connected. The silence is no longer something you need to fill. It becomes part of the presence. And in moments like that, you begin to realize something. Maybe what you've been searching for was never someone who would dramatically change your life, but someone who makes you feel like you don't have to change to stay. They don't have to be perfect. They have unfinished parts too, just like you. And maybe that's what makes everything feel more real. There's no pressure to idealize, no need to hold on to a perfect image. Just two people, sharing the same space in a way that feels natural. And slowly, you begin to notice things you may have overlooked before. You feel more at ease without having to explain yourself. You realize you're no longer afraid of being misunderstood the way you once were. You start to appreciate simple things, a quiet conversation, or just the presence of someone beside you. Small things, but enough to create a very different feeling. And maybe, within that gentle difference, you come to understand something deeper. That you don't have to become a better version of yourself by someone else's standards to be valued. You don't have to be perfect to be chosen. You just have to be yourself, with all the parts that are still unfinished. And maybe the person who helped you see that was never meant to change your life in a loud, dramatic way, but to arrive quietly, just enough for you to see yourself a little more clearly. Not because they gave you something new, but because they helped you notice what had always been there. And then, as you begin to grow familiar with that presence, something else quietly begins to appear. Not obvious, not loud, but enough for you to feel that something is staying. There are feelings in this life that don't arrive with a clear name. You can't fully call it love, but you can't dismiss it as something fleeting either. It doesn't live in spoken words. It doesn't need a definition to exist. And yet, somehow, you know it's there. It shows up in the most ordinary moments, when you're doing something unrelated and suddenly, you think of them. No clear reason, nothing just happened. Just a very soft presence in your mind, and you don't rush to push it away. You let it stay, like a passing thought. That doesn't pass. Sometimes it lives in silence. Before, silence might have felt uncomfortable, an empty space you needed to fill with sound, with words, with distraction. But now, there are moments when you sit still, and you don't feel empty anymore. Not because you're thinking too much, but because you're feeling something. Very subtle. A presence without form, without explanation. Just there. You may not talk about it with anyone. Not because you're hiding it, but because even you aren't sure what to call it. If you name it too soon, it might lose its natural shape. If you try to understand it too quickly, it might become heavier than it needs to be. So, you let it be. No definition, no pressure, just a quiet awareness that something inside you is very real. Some feelings don't need to be proven. They don't need clear answers. They don't need conclusions. They simply need to be felt. And maybe what makes them special is that they're not trying to become anything else. It's not a feeling that takes control of you. It doesn't demand that you change everything. It doesn't pull you out of your life. Instead, it lives quietly within your life, like a gentle current, not disturbing anything, but enough to remind you you're living a little deeper now. You begin to notice how you experience things. Moments that once felt ordinary now seem to carry an extra layer of meaning, not because they changed, but because you did. You listen more, you observe more, and sometimes you stay silent a little longer. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you're feeling more than words can hold. And within all of that, there's a quiet truth you begin to sense. Not every feeling needs to be clear to matter. Not every connection needs a name to be meaningful. Some things simply exist in their own way, and that alone is enough. You may never find the exact word for what this is, and maybe that's not really important, because sometimes the value of a feeling isn't in how well you understand it, but in the fact that you truly felt it. And if you listen long enough, you might realize this isn't something that needs to be explained. It's an experience, one that can only be felt when you're fully present within yourself, quiet, deep, and undeniably real. And then in a very natural way, you begin to notice that something is shifting within you, not in the outside world, not in anything clearly visible, but somewhere quiet, somewhere deep, a place you may not have spent much time listening to before. This person didn't do anything extraordinary. They didn't try to change you. They didn't offer big advice or lead you in any particular direction. And yet, in a very gentle way, their presence seemed to touch something inside you, and slowly you began to look back at yourself. And from that point on, you started to change, not in a sudden way. Not like waking up one day and everything is completely different, but in small movements, so subtle that almost no one else would notice. And yet, you can feel them clearly. You begin to slow down. In the way you think, you no longer react as quickly as before. In the way you listen, you're not rushing to find answers anymore. You give yourself a little more time, a brief pause, just enough to feel what's truly happening inside. And in that pause, you begin to hear yourself more clearly. You start to notice what brings you a sense of ease, even in the simplest moments. A quiet afternoon, a conversation that doesn't need many words, or just the feeling of being alone, without feeling empty. You're no longer chasing everything, no longer trying to keep up with the outside world. Instead, you begin to choose. You choose what feels right for you. You choose what resonates, even when you can't fully explain why. Things that once felt important begin to feel lighter. Not because they were wrong, but because your perspective has changed. You're no longer holding on to things just because you're used to them. You begin to let go, not as a form of giving up, but as a quiet understanding that some things have already fulfilled their role in your life. And what's interesting is, no one asked you to change this way. There's no pressure to become better by someone else's standards. Everything is happening from within, naturally, quietly, but clearly enough that you can't ignore it. And maybe, what makes this journey meaningful isn't how much you've changed, but how you've come to recognize that change. You're no longer trying to become a perfect version of yourself, no longer chasing an ideal image. You're simply moving closer to who you are, little by little. There may still be moments when things feel unclear, moments when you wonder where you're going, or who you're becoming. But this time, you don't rush to find the answer. You allow yourself to be in the process. You allow things to unfold at their own pace. And in that quiet patience, you begin to understand that growth is not always loud. It doesn't need big turning points to prove that something is changing. Sometimes, growth is simply knowing when to pause, learning to listen to yourself a little more, and choosing what brings you peace. And maybe, this is how you are growing, not in a way others can easily see, but in a way only you can truly feel. A journey that is deeply personal, quietly real, and just enough for you to know that you are not the same as before. Even if the change is small, it's a small shift that truly matters. And then, after all those quiet shifts that have been unfolding within you, there comes a moment when you begin to realize something you may have never truly considered before. Not a sudden breakthrough, not a clear answer appearing all at once, but a gradual understanding, like looking at a painting from a distance where each detail slowly reveals itself over time. You begin to understand that not everyone who enters your life is meant to stay. And somehow, this no longer makes you as sad as it once did. It doesn't carry the same sense of loss. It simply becomes a natural part of the journey. Some people arrive, touch your life in a very gentle way, and then continue on their own path. Not because they didn't matter, but maybe their role was never to stay forever. Maybe their role was simply to arrive at the right time. At the moment, you needed to see yourself more clearly. At the moment, you began listening more deeply to what was happening within you. And in a way that's hard to explain, they become a mirror, not for you to see them, but for you to see yourself more clearly. You begin to notice how you feel things, how you respond, how you once tried to hold on to things that no longer fit, just because you were afraid to lose them. But now, something has shifted. You no longer feel the need to hold everything so tightly, not because you don't care, but because you're starting to understand that the more tightly you hold on, the heavier it becomes. So you begin to let go, a little more gently, not letting go because the feeling is gone, not letting go as a form of giving up, but as a quiet acceptance that every connection has its own rhythm. Some things come to stay, and some things come just to pass through, and still leave something behind. And maybe those traces are what stay the longest. You begin to look back at your journey, not with regret, but with understanding. Understanding that every moment, every person, every feeling has shaped who you are now. They may not be beside you in the way you once imagined, but what they brought into your life is still there, in the way you think, in the way you feel, in the way you meet yourself. And maybe that's what truly matters. Not whether you were able to keep them, not whether things unfolded the way you once hoped, but who you became through it all. You may not have seen it at first, but when you look back now, you can feel it. You've changed, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that feels real. You're no longer trying to be a version of yourself that's easier to be liked. You're no longer chasing standards you once believed were necessary. You're living closer to your own emotions, more honest with what you truly want, and a little gentler with yourself when things aren't perfect. There may still be questions without answers, still things you don't fully understand, but they don't make you feel as unsettled as before, because you're beginning to trust that not everything needs to be clear right away. Some things just need to be lived, some people just need to be met, and some feelings just need to be felt, to be meaningful. And within all of this, you come to realize something very quiet, yet very deep. The value of a journey is not in how long it lasts, or how it ends, but in how much more honest you've become with yourself along the way. And maybe that's something no one can take from you. A version of you that no longer needs to become someone else, no longer needs to hold on to what doesn't fit. Just you, in your most natural form. And maybe, when you reach that place, you begin to understand that some things don't stay, but were never meaningless, because they were the very things that guided you back to where you've always belonged, to yourself. And then, after all those subtle movements within you, one day arrives without any warning. Everything is still unfolding, just as it always has, and yet, in a quiet, almost unexplainable way, the space around you feels a little more still. Not complete silence, not that everything has stopped, but a softer kind of quiet, like sitting in a familiar room and suddenly realizing you're no longer being pulled by your thoughts the way you once were. You don't question as much anymore. You're no longer trying to find clear answers for everything that once weighed on your mind. The questions that used to echo inside you, somehow, they begin to fade into the distance. Not because you've solved everything, but maybe you no longer feel the need to solve it all right now. There's a quiet sense of acceptance that begins to appear. No announcement, no declaration. Just you, sitting there, realizing that you're okay, even without having all the answers. Your emotions aren't as overwhelming as before. No more constant waves rising and falling. No more urgency to hold on, to understand, to define everything. Instead, there is space. A kind of stillness that doesn't make you anxious, that doesn't feel empty, but strangely feels full, even if you can't explain why, like water after the wind has stopped. No more ripples, but still holding depth. You can look into it and see more clearly without distortion. Or, like a piece of music that has just ended, the sound is gone, but the echo remains. And somehow, that quiet after the music is where you feel most deeply what just passed through you. And in that moment, you realize your heart is no longer restless. Not because you've lost feeling, not because you've become distant or cold, but maybe you've gone through enough to understand that not every feeling needs to stay intense forever. Some emotions, once fully experienced, naturally begin to settle. They don't disappear. They simply change form. What once confused you becomes something you can look back on more gently. What once demanded answers becomes something you can accept as part of your journey. And within that settling, you begin to understand, not through analysis, not through explanation, but through a quiet, deep awareness. You begin to see that not everything needs a clear conclusion, not every connection needs a name. Some things arrive, just to let you feel a part of yourself, and then they gently step back. And that doesn't take away from their meaning. If anything, maybe it's because they didn't last forever that you were able to feel them so deeply. In the moment, your heart becomes still. Nothing is lost. Everything has simply found its place. No more crowding, no more confusion, no more trying to understand beyond what is needed. Just there, quietly. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, you feel like you don't need to chase anything. No rushing, no holding on. Just being here, in this moment, feeling a sense of peace spreading from within. A kind of peace that doesn't come from everything being perfect, but from no longer resisting what has been or what is. And maybe, when your heart becomes still in this way, you begin to realize you haven't lost your feelings. You're simply learning to feel them in a way that is lighter, deeper, and more real. And as that stillness begins to feel more familiar, you may start to notice something you once saw very differently. There are moments when emotions begin to settle, and people often call that an ending. Something has passed, a connection is no longer the same, a chapter has closed. But this time, it doesn't feel that way to you. There's no sharp sense of loss, no heavy emptiness, just a quiet lightness, like setting something down you've been holding for far too long. And you begin to wonder, maybe this isn't an ending. Maybe it's a completion. Something has reached the end of its natural path. It doesn't need to continue. It doesn't need to be held onto to become something else. It was there. It happened. It left its mark. And now, it returns to its place within the flow of your life. Not gone, just no longer at the front like before. You begin to look back on everything you've been through, not with regret, but with understanding. A glance that once made you pause, a feeling that once confused you, a presence that once shifted something inside you. None of these move you the same way now, but they're still there, like quiet pieces that help shape something real within you. And maybe what makes it all feel lighter is not that these things no longer matter, but that you no longer need to hold on to them the same way. You're no longer trying to keep a feeling just because you're afraid it might disappear. No longer holding a connection just to avoid the space it might leave behind. Instead, you let things be what they are. They arrive when they're meant to. They stay when they're meant to. And they leave when they've given what they came to give. No resistance, no force. Just a quiet acceptance. And within that acceptance, you begin to see that not everything needs to be held onto to have meaning. Some experiences, when lived fully, remain within you in a completely different way, not as memories that pull you back, but as a part of you, quietly shaping how you see the world, how you feel, and how you move forward. You don't carry everything, but you carry what matters most, the way you've learned to listen to yourself, the way you've come to understand that not everything needs to last to be meaningful, and the way you've realized that the value of a journey is not in how it ends, but in how it changes you as you move through it. Maybe that person is no longer beside you the way they once were. Maybe the story didn't unfold the way you imagined, but that doesn't make it any less meaningful. If anything, maybe it's the imperfections that made it more real. You don't need to rewrite the story to make it complete. You don't need to add what never happened just to feel at peace with it. You can simply see it for what it was, a part of your life, a part of you, and then you realize you don't need to hold on to everything to prove that it mattered. You only need to keep moving forward with what has truly remained within you, not as untouched memories, not as the same emotions, but as a quiet, deep understanding that some things don't come to stay forever. They come to complete something within you, and once that is complete, there's nothing left to hold on to. You simply continue, a little lighter, a little clearer, and a little closer to yourself. And maybe this isn't an ending at all. Maybe it's a pause, a beautiful, quiet pause between two chapters of your life. A moment where you can finally see how far you've come before you take the next step forward. And then, after everything you've been through, there comes a moment when you pause, not to search for more, but simply to look back, not to measure what you've lost, not to question what should have been different, just to look gently. And in that quiet reflection, you begin to notice something that may seem simple, but perhaps you've never truly felt it this clearly before. That person may still be in your life, or maybe They've already taken a different path without you even realizing when. But in a very quiet way, it no longer feels like their staying or their leaving is the most important thing. Not because they no longer matter, but because you begin to see more clearly what truly remains. It's you. Not the version of you from the days when everything felt uncertain. Not the version of you who was still searching for clear answers, but the you right now. A version that may not be more perfect, but is more at peace. Not without emotions, but no longer carried away by every feeling the way you once were. You begin to understand your own heart in a different way. You know when to hold something close and when to let it go. You're no longer afraid of silence because you've learned how to be at ease within yourself. And maybe the biggest change is not in what happened between you and that person, but in how you see yourself after it all. You're no longer trying to become someone who is easier to be liked, no longer searching for validation from the outside. You begin to trust your own feelings more deeply. To trust what feels right to you, even when you can't fully explain it. Things may not have unfolded the way you once imagined. The story may not have a clear ending the way you once hoped. But somehow, that doesn't take away from its meaning. If anything, maybe it's the imperfection that makes it feel more real. Because life, in its own way, doesn't always need a perfect ending to be meaningful. Sometimes, what remains is not the story itself, but who you became after living through it. A version of you who listens more, who knows when to slow down, who learns to appreciate the smallest things that once went unnoticed. And maybe, if there is something this journey was meant to give you, it wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding yourself in a way that feels more honest. This was never a journey outward. It was always a journey back to your feelings, back to your inner stillness, back to the version of you that doesn't need to try so hard to become. And when you arrive there, you may begin to realize nothing happened to turn you into someone else. Everything happened to help you remember who you've always been. And maybe that is what truly remains. Not a name, not a relationship, but a deep connection between you and yourself. A connection that doesn't need explanation, but is enough for you to know that wherever life takes you next, you can always return. Return to yourself. And this time, you're no longer searching. You're simply living with a quiet kind of peace, deep enough to know you've truly been through it all and carried forward what mattered most. This is not an ending. It's a quiet beginning where you move forward, not to find what is missing, but to live with what is already enough.